Kei te whakaronga au ki te tangi o te manu nei, ko te tui, tui au. Tui a ki roka, tui a ki raro, tui a ki waho, tui a ki roto, tui a ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama, a whānau, haramai te tōki, haumi e hui e, tai ki e. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te maipakai waho ko kapakatau mā haka, tēnā koe, kei te mihi ki te ao ko ofio, rere atu, ki te tai o rabu vai, ka rere te wai te tai o rabu vai, ki te tai ara te uru, tēnā koutou. Ka mihi ki te whenua kei raro, ko unu kapu i te raki, te kua tēnei whenua, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou, nau mai haere mai tauti mai, ki a koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai tauti mai ki raro i tēnei mauka, nau mai haere mai tauti mai ki tēnei waka hoki, ko te kua tēnei waka, te waka aoraki, kei te tiro atu, ki uta, ki aoraki, tēnā koe. Te tiro atu ki te wahi, ki te wai, paunamu. Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou. Nau mai haere mai tauti mai ki tēnei whenua. When I welcomed you here today, and welcome to everybody to this very special occasion, I started with a small karakia, and that karakia said that I've been listening to the birds. And those birds, particularly the tui, he sings a song and he talks about drawing things together, about drawing the ends in, drawing the information, drawing the knowledge into one place. That knowledge that comes from up above, that knowledge that comes from down below, that knowledge that comes from outside, that knowledge that comes from inside, needs to be all drawn together at one place at one time. It also makes that allusion to that knowledge that comes on the four winds, from the north, the knowledge from the north, from the west, from the east, from the south. And the drawing all of that knowledge together, all of that news together, that's when we join together and we move forward together. And today is a day about drawing knowledge from the north into the south. The other words that I spoke of were the words that talked about the landscape that we sit in here underneath Mount Karley, Kapakatau Mahaka, beside this river. The places, the landscapes, the geography that give us the strength that we have, that let us know where we are, that let us put our feet on the ground and to breathe. And whenever we talk about landscape, we think about that place that we are now, we think about the places that we have been, and how just like the tui, when he flies around, we gather from all of those places. And luckily today we're going to hear stories about places far off, about footprints in other lands, but we're going to particularly hear about those footprints and how they sit with ours in this landscape. And when I talked about mountains, I talked about Kapakatau Mahaka, but then I went inland to Aoraki. And when I was talking about Aoraki, I made allusions to the story there about Te Waka Aoraki, that canoe that we're all in together. And once again, a metaphor of us travelling together, of being in a far off place but now being here. And I shifted down the side of Aoraki, down to the west coast. I slipped down the side into that place known as the Pounamu Waters, the place where the Pounamu sits, that stone that we can hold, that we can think of, that mauri, that life force, that energy. And it's interesting, whenever I'm lucky enough to be invited to come and open such important proceedings as this, I'm thinking, what's the connection with this place and the person that's going to speak? And of course that connection was written in the bio. And that connection is Te Waipounam. This place, this island, this waka, this canoe that we're standing in. But of course sometimes Te Waipounam was written as Te Wahi Pounamu, the waters of Pounamu, or the place of Pounamu. And we all know what Pounamu is, that special green rock. This is the place of that special green rock. It's not quite the Emerald Isles, but I'm sure that that heart that beats within those two places is the same, from one Emerald Isle to Te Waipona. So I'd like to now invite Una McGurr to make the official introduction. So no mai haere mai tauti mai kei raro I te maro o tēnei mauka o ēnei mauka. No mai haere mai tauti mai I tēnei wahi, te Waipona, the place of emerald.
Kia ora ron. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A harja. Bonach te, orif, August Forsha Roaf and Show. I'm welcoming you today in Irish, which is Mary's native tongue that she carries with her. Welcome, Mary. Welcome to all of you here today. No mai haere mai. I welcome you on behalf of Dr. Megan Gibbons, who is the Chief Executive of Otago Polytechnic, and I welcome you today also as the Chair of the Otago Polytechnic Professorial. So it's my very great honour to be here today and to welcome Mary to give her inaugural lecture as part of her own practice as a professor here at Otago Polytechnic. Before I hand over to Mary, I'd like to also welcome you on behalf of the whānau of Otago Polytechnic, which stretches, as you know, far and wide across these fabulous islands, because we have more than one island here, and across to many other islands around the globe, through our alumni and the many people whose lives we have touched and who have touched ours. And I say that also in honour of Mary, who's had a long and illustrious career in many parts of the world. I have to also now give you some slightly less salubrious detail, which is around the housekeeping. So if we need to exit the building in the event of an alarm going, there is an exit over here, follow the green man, and there's an exit here, and we have assembly points outside. Colleagues here in the room will be able to guide us. If you need to take a comfort break, we have bathrooms around here, and we also have bathrooms over there. And also to remind you that after Mary's lecture, we will be inviting you to join us to bless the kai and to share kai with us, which is part of our practice here in our cultural landscape. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Mary Butler, Professor Mary Butler, to come and give her inaugural professorial lecture. Thank you.
So I'm not Mary, but my name's Dr. Bridget Murphin-Veach. I'm the director of the Donald Beasley Institute, and Mary has asked me to introduce her professorial lecture today. So tēnā koutou katoa. It is an enormous pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Mary Butler, who after several false starts is today finally getting the opportunity to deliver her inaugural professorial lecture here in person at Te Kura Matakini ki Otago, right here today. So fantastic we've got here in person. Well, I'm very humbled that Mary's asked me to play this small part in an enormously important event in her professional life. I know that there's another person who would have loved to fulfill this role for her. Unfortunately, that person is no longer with us, but there is no question that it is the link between the three of us that has led me to be here today introducing Mary. In about, and forgive me if I've got the timing slightly wrong, but in about 2003, as I was struggling to complete my own PhD, I met a vibrant, lively, interesting and interested doctoral student named Mary Butler, a University of Otago PhD recipient. Mary was supervised by a number of people, but including a well-known and well-respected disability scholar, Associate Professor Anne Bray. Anne was the director of the Donald Beasley Institute for Disability Research, and she was also my doctoral supervisor and my boss. One of Anne's strengths was her ability to draw like-minded people, including emerging researchers, together. She recognised that research could be difficult and that researchers frequently feel a bit lost and alone as they traverse complex research experiences and processes. By bringing researchers together, Anne hoped and knew we could support each other, learn from each other, and hopefully deliver the transformative research that we all aspire to produce. So in her way, Anne drew Mary into the Donald Beasley Institute, and Mary became part of the DBI family. And she fit with us as she shared similar values. She was not simply a researcher, but also an advocate and an activist. She was someone who cared deeply for her research participants and their whānau, and someone who didn't just want to do research, but someone who was committed to achieving change through research. In fact, long before transformative research was a thing, as my children would say, a commonly used and understood term, Mary embodied the values of this approach. But when we look at Mary's trajectory as an academic and a researcher, it is clear that long before she found her way to us, she had always been a person who was destined to make a difference through her ability to build trusting relationships with other people. For instance, in 1990, university student Mary was awarded the Jane Wilson McCallum Award for student contribution, the student contributing most to the life of the student body. Can't you all just imagine that? Her doctoral research was similarly relational. It involved painstakingly detailed ethnographic work, and Mary effectively immersing herself in the lives of her participants in order to learn about them in a way that enabled her to capture and to convey the essence of their lives. In doing so, she developed a level of relationship not always achieved through research. Her academic life here at Otago Polytechnic shows the same emphasis and commitment to relationship as the conduit to positive outcomes for students, colleagues, and the wider community. Mary shows great leadership in this regard and is a tremendous role model for the next generation of occupational therapy professionals, educators, and researchers. Her interest is authentic and her enthusiasm infectious and unparalleled. So without further ado this time, I introduce to you Professor Mary Butler, Irish girl and South Island's first Professor of Occupational Therapy. It is no surprise that her lecture is titled Our People Make a Better World, Reflections of an Occupational Therapist. So congratulations, Mary, on this well-deserved acknowledgement of your professional contribution to this institution, our local community, and much further beyond. And I know it's been achieved through your exemplary teaching and research, but also through your generous and genuine spirit. So, welcome.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Una. Thank you, Ron. This is so good to be affirmed in this way before putting my voice into this space. Thank you all so much for coming today. It is lovely to see so many friendly faces here and so many people who've been part of my story. Thank you for coming and making the effort during this confusing time. My first inaugural was on the day of lockdown in March, so that didn't go ahead. So at level 2 it is rather confusing. So thank you for coming and for being socially distant, and we give you all permission not to go around hugging and kissing, which is rather difficult when I see old friends for the first time in a long time. It has been quite a year. This was the year that started with the Australian fires when 1 billion animals were burned. There was the near war between the US and Iran. We nearly had Trump impeached. We actually had Brexit. The #MeToo movement led to Harvey Weinstein going to prison. The murder of George Floyd set off the next wave of Black Lives Matters. It was the end of Otago Polytech and the beginning of what we now know as NZIST. And of course it was the year of COVID. So thank you for coming to help me to celebrate this time. I want to talk about how occupational therapy can be a force for good and how we can make a better world. This is my mother, Phyllis Shanahan, standing by the Vartry River in Wicklow where I grew up. And the motto of our family is Marar Carsoila, which means my vision to far places, and that certainly came true. So I was an immigrant from a very early age. I left Ireland at the age of 20, and by my early 30s I was in New Zealand. So this is my beginning, Tēnā koutou. Ko Ireland, te Turangawaiwai, I Tupakaaka, Aki Wicklow, I Raro, I Te Maru, I Te Mako o Sugarloaf, I Te Taha o Te Awa o Vartree, Ke Te Roho Oki o Te Poti, Ko Butler te Iwi, Ko Shanahan Rato, Ko Butler, Ko Reedy, Ko Kavanagh, Ka Whanau, Ko Mikrawa, Ko Phyllis Ka Matua, Ka Ao Tene, Ko Mary Toko Ingoa, Norera Tenakoto Katoa. All stories in Ireland start with once upon a time. We're a land of storytellers, and once upon a time in Ireland can be told in so many different ways. It can be told through our archaeology, it can be told through our history, and it can be told through our mythology. So I'm going to talk about the land of Ireland through all these lenses. And it makes sense for me to do this because my first career was in archaeology. And as an emigrant, we are always challenged to know where we come from. We need to know in our bones where we come from in order to be able to adapt and to be in another country. So here's the archaeological version of Ireland. In about 1300, that was the end of the Ice Age, and the ice extended over the whole of Ireland except for the southwest tippy toes at the very bottom, but there was no people then. And then the sea rose, and about the year 8000 BC, Ireland was an island, and there's nothing like an island to make people set sail. About 1,000 years later, the first Mesolithic people came to Ireland, and they became the people. And then there was great times in Ireland. About 3000 BC, there was the age of the megaliths, the great stones and the henges and Newgrange and all of these amazing stones that are still telling stories, that still make me feel at home when I go back there. And a few thousand years later, Christianity came to Ireland, and we did well during the Dark Ages in Europe. That is when our greatest flourishing was, when the Book of Kells was written, when some of the great stone crosses were carved. We held on to Christianity for good or ill during that time. So there's a history of Ireland, and this is the history of Ireland where my family might start. In the 12th century, when the Anglo-Normans came to the southeast coast, and they were the first winds of colonization. But the Anglo-Normans became more Irish than the Irish themselves, and that's the Butlers, that's the Butler side of things. But the colonization continued, and Ireland had 800 years of colonizing. And the penal laws came, and the direct result of such things were the great famines. The first one in 1740 that killed 20% of the population, and the next one which took 15% of the population, which was over 1 million people, and that was in 1845. And that 1845 one started off the great wave of emigration that has never, ever stopped. The diaspora of Ireland means that there are more Irish at any time over in other countries than there ever are in Ireland, and I'm part of that. The great wave continues. But I'm still proud to be Irish. I still feel like I belong in Ireland. And I look to that place all the time. And I look to that place through the stories and through the mythology that comes. And of course, stories are only true in stories. It's true in a story, whether it's true or not, I used to tell my children. These are the given stories. They've been interpreted down through the ages, or they would not have lasted. So they are our stories. The Book of Invasions was written in the 11th century, and it was the story of how Ireland was invaded by wave after wave. And the last wave was the Milesians, and these were who became the Gaels. And when the first of the Milesians set foot on Ireland, it was Amergin, and he was a poet and a druid. And he said a song at that time. He invoked the spirit of Ireland as he set foot on the land. And this is the myth of our beginnings. So Amergin was a poet and a druid, and I'm going to sing what he said. And I would like you to bear with me while I just have my sister sing behind me. wind on sea, wave swelling, ocean's voice, stag of 7 clashes, falcon on cliff, sunlit dewdrop, rarest of herbs, boar enraged, salmon in pool, lake in plain, fortified hilltop, learning's essence, sharpened spear dealing death, God who kindles fire in the head. That's my sister singing it in Gaelic, a thing I wouldn't try to do. Have I got it back? I have, okay. This poem was translated for me by Sean Tahoe. I didn't realize what I was asking when I asked him to do it. And it was a great honor for him to do it. So I'm going to say it now in Te Reo. Koao te ho o te moana, kangaro paoro, katangi o te moana. Te tia whawhai maha, te manu ki matapare. Kahihi o te rā, kahua ahure. Te poem hukuriri, te hamanaki roto i te puna. Te moana mania, kapuka whakamaru. Te moru e te mataranga. Ka whakahora te mate, ka tau te aroha. And for me, this poem expresses a way of invoking the land, evoking the spirit of the land, which is what we need at this time. It puts the relationship with the land in the correct way. We are the guardians of the land, not the stewards. So I want to explain a little more about why this translation of Amergan's song is such a gift that joins my sense of belonging to both Ireland and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I use a circle, the line, and the spiral to represent my thinking. You can see the Song of Amergan as simply being a song. It is a song that's been sung over and over again for 1,000 years. And it's a particular song that tells us how we're shaped by nature, not shaping nature. Like a falcon on the wind says, shape me to the wind. And that's like the circle. We do things over and over again. But as humans, we can't help ourselves. We're always making and shaping. And this is in linear time. We shape the land with our ideas, and we make the world that we live in. And the writing down of Amergan was also a making. The one who made it put his pen down at one point, and he picked it up at another. And he continued till it was finished, and there's a durable artifact that has lasted that 1,000 years. It stands the test of time. This is how we make our world. The spiral is my symbol how the song is part of a story. It's a story that we've told for 1,000 years. The spiral represents the integration of the circular and the linear, a world that's both revolving and moving forward. And it's a representation for me of transformation. It's a cyclical journey that opens a path towards a dynamic future where traditional and modern can converge. The Whakatoki, Kamua Kamuri, that many will know, which is walking backwards into the future, is what this idea of the spiral is. So when I tell the story of Amergan, I tell the story of people who came first to the land. The Gaels came first to the land. And those who came after did not respect that belonging, and they tried to own the land. And the Song of Armageddon is an Irish person's way of pushing off the yoke of what colonialism has done and to find pride in our origin and our language and our stories. And from this story of indigeneity, I can understand more deeply the origin stories in New Zealand. And it tells me about the correct relationship with the land and with its indigenous people. And I remember that somebody said to me when I became a citizen, "You belong to the same place as us now." But this belonging was slow to come. To be Pākehā is to be tied to a land that you've left behind. You're born into one story, and you get on a plane and you cast yourself into another story. And inevitably you get many, many things wrong. And you jar in this new story. And you ask without expectation for forgiveness for all the things you get wrong, for all your little rudenesses. And you set an intention to be part of this story. And this is the promise that you make. I've heard that the first promise could be seen as when a mother takes a child to her breast and promises that she will look after that child and will carry that child through a story that lasts its lifetime. And in that way, I see the Treaty of Waitangi as just such a promise. It's a live document. It is not completed. It is not final. So when Sean translated that poem for me, that Song of Armageddon, and gifted it to me, I understood more about that long business of coming and belonging to another land. Don't you hate when the numbers don't do exactly what they're supposed to do? So, oh, here we are. So, backwards and forwards. So some of you will recognize this, my allegiance to Hannah Arendt, which should come through here. Hannah Arendt is somebody who has accompanied my intellectual journey, and I map those symbols onto the work of Hannah Arendt. Arendt describes the ways, in different ways, that we move from our private life into a world where we are part of a political arena. And I want to use these as a way of talking about, thinking about how occupational therapists use activities to sculpt change from inside out, how they help people to know how to go on. And I talk about people as patients here because the etymology of patient is one who suffers. And we're in the business of transforming suffering through the everyday things that occupational therapists do. So the place I start is labour. And labour is all these things. It's cyclical. It is futile, essentially. It is totally necessary, but as soon as we clean, we have to clean again. As soon as we cook, we have to cook again. We can spend a lot of our time making people independent in all these things, but we don't want to keep people too long in that space. And making something is a more linear process. We know it's so valuable to make something, to feel the time is slowed down, that there is a beginning and a middle and an end. And we help people to make something that feels like they have something to give to the world. Patricia Grace puts it this way: I make myself and I give it. And action is when you enter into the dynamic spiral. And for Arendt, this was the pre-political space. More than anything, Hannah Arendt knew that the cruelest thing that we could do is to ignore somebody. Hannah Arendt was a Jew, German Jew. So this is exactly what happens to many of our patients who live with chronic conditions. Action is where we want to help people to feel like they belong and that they are part of a story. So I'm going to give you two examples from people I've worked with, more as colleagues than as clients, but every occupational therapist will have these stories. Working with William Fairbank, William was an artist who had a brain injury. And together we made a film about 6 artists who had brain injury. After his brain injury, William never did work again. He made his way from the UK to New Zealand, and we found each other when I invited him to talk at a seminar. William is really superb at attracting people to him, and somehow he manages to transcend that brain injury, even though it never goes away, and in many ways it's very visible. He does this through his creativity. He moves beyond suffering and silence into demonstrating to people what it means to suffer, and so he's a teacher about the land of brain injury. So the film that we made featured 6 artists, but it also included his own work as an artist, where he worked to make the Stations of Cross in the first 7 years after his brain injury, and he called that his occupational therapy. And the Stations of the Cross are now on permanent display in Lincoln Cathedral. And he found his way to being able to be who he needed to be in all these contexts. It's the ordinary things that we do as occupational therapists that help people to do this. I'm going to talk about somebody else here today who's actually here, Karley Parker, who's a student I followed for a couple of years while she was going through her studies here, and who did an enormous job of teaching me what it's like to go through her studies with a visual impairment. Last year I recommended a book to Karley. It was called Overstory, and it was a story about trees. And Karley, who has 10% vision, doesn't see trees in the same way that we do. She explained to me that it isn't in that kind of three-dimensional ways that she sees it. But one of the things that Karley did when she was studying was to manifest her learning into 3 dimensions, and she started to sculpt trees. And one of the things that she did was to gift me with this tree at the end of her studies, which was her understanding of what trees mean. And I want to think through what that actually means in terms of how work of artists who happen to have a disability helps us to articulate a new kind of story about the ways that disability isn't simply about being allowed into a world. It is about teaching us about diversity in whole new ways, and that's what the art done by people with disability can do for us. It can show us whole new ways of being when people are that capable. And they can speak their suffering, yes, but it's not art therapy. It is art that truly expresses and takes us into a land that we wouldn't otherwise understand. And for that, I'm enormously grateful for the relationship that I've had with people with disability, because I wouldn't have otherwise understood those things. And now I'm going to talk about the brain injury years. The brain injury years was essentially all of my studies. In the brain injury years, I did my master's, which was a single case study of an individual with brain injury, looking at how, as an occupational therapist, I could work with him in order to get him engaged fully in life, to do art, to have a job, even though he required 24 hours a day care. And then I went on and I did my PhD, which was an ethnography, as Bridget said, of 6 families who were all in their own way doing extraordinary work, because each family was working with an individual, a loved one who had significant brain injury, who required significant hours of caring. And each of them carried those people through to a good life. I deliberately chose people who had significant brain injury, but also people who were 7 years post-injury, because I wanted to see what had happened, what would happen when people supposedly had plateaued. And what I demonstrated through my PhD is that people keep on living, that prognosis is not destiny, that there is always hope, that people keep living and growing after brain injury. And that for me was an answer that I needed to a question that I was asking, or was asked by patients and by families: what will happen? Well, I know that life can be good if you have people who love you, if you have people who can care for you, if you have people who can keep you safe. And that was a lot of the work of these families, keeping people safe first of all. If you've got a brain injury, can be quite a job, because You can end up in prison, you can end up getting kicked out of school, you can end up breaking up relationships. So family is there to hold you in that safety. And family is also there, even for these adults, to help them to thrive, to help them to find jobs, to help them to buy a house if that's what they need to do, to have a relationship, to pay their bills, to go to school, to do all of those things that will help them to thrive. But I would say that most importantly, what families do with these people is, these patients, these people who have suffered, is to ensure that they have a place in the world. And they do that because they're strong families and they help them to find their way. And they're proud families, they're good families who never give up and who keep on ensuring that they have that kind of space. So now I'm going to talk about some of the projects I did after my postdoc. So these are the vision years. After my postdoc, I sat down and I thought, now what do I do? I want to make a difference. I want to do something that's actually going to make a difference in the world. I had done a lot of work with brain injury. I was coming back into occupational therapy as a teacher, and I wanted to know how I could work effectively. And so I looked at ways of doing that. I asked around. I listened to my students. I listened to the people around me. I looked for what needed to be done. That's what occupational therapists do. We fill gaps, don't we? We're good at that. We're proud of that. We find what needs to be done and we do it. And what I discovered was that vision was not being done well in New Zealand, not in any shape or form. We used to have vision clinics and they had gone. So I decided to work in this area, and it just so happened I met key people. I met Evelyn Holsteel, who was doing her master's, and she was asking the question, what happens to people who aren't helped by the Blind Foundation? And it just so happened that at that same point of time, about 7 or 8 years ago, Lindley Hood was discovering for herself that there weren't services for people who had low vision, who weren't actually eligible for the Blind Foundation. And she started a group called the Visual Impairment Charitable Trust Aotearoa with Gordon Sanderson. And I've been working with Lindley closely ever since. So I chose to do this because it was also one of the top 10 areas I thought occupational therapy could make a difference to people. And it just so happened that my ideas about integrating teaching and research and a kind of politics was exactly what the Polytech was in the business of doing during that time. And so it was possible to bring these things together and to develop this work in vision, because I could work with students in terms of authentic assessment and authentic learning in ways where the students were really making the difference. So these are the projects that we did during those years. The first one was the simulation project, because this was a project where I had the first question I had was, how can I teach people in an already crowded curriculum about vision? There's not a smidgen of space in any 3-year degree course in a Polytech. And so I wanted to look at something which was interesting and engaging, but I knew was problematic. So the whole idea of doing vision simulation is often used, but in the disability literature is considered to be problematic. It's problematic because in lots of ways it's been questioned in the literature. So with Kerry McMullen as my research assistant, who happened to be doing her master's at the same time, we did a project on listening, first of all, to people with visual impairment about how they felt about us doing vision simulation. And there was lots of different opinions, and that was clear, but we learned some things that we could do to make it more correct. And it just so happened that there was a group of first years at that time who wanted to run an event using vision simulation, so that became our research. And from that we developed a series of guidelines, and it has now been successfully integrated into teaching. The next project that I worked on was the Lichting Project. I started to think, what's one simple thing that occupational therapists could do? What's the simplest thing? What's the lowest level intervention that I could maybe get across to occupational therapists that would really make a difference to people with visual impairment? And this is what occupational therapists do all the time anyway. They're always looking for the simple thing that they can do that can help them to relate to people. The thing about lighting is that I was thinking about this at the exact moment when there was a revolution in lighting anyway, and LED was coming in. So I got some funding from the Participatory Science platform to run a series of workshops with older adults about how to read a light bulb, and thinking about ideas about how we could more effectively do assessment of lighting in homes and how we could actually integrate it. And we ended up doing work where we were collaborating with lighting shops. And along the way, I was able to teach third-year students how to do a very rapid lighting home assessment. We developed a home assessment, which is a really good thing to learn as an occupational therapist. And I got the third years to teach the first years how to do it, which was also a really nice way of learning and teaching. And of course, it's something that can make a real difference to older adults, because if you get to the age of 60, you're likely to need between 3 and 10 times more lighting than a younger person. So it's something that you can immediately make a difference for people with. And particular visual conditions like macular degeneration are particularly helped by having lighting. But all eye conditions can be helped potentially by it. So the next project that I got into was the vision screening one. And this is one which my students led me into. Students on Fieldwork 5 placement asked me if they could use a vision screening toolkit that I had just got copyright to bring into the country, the Eyes Right toolkit. And they asked me if they could bring it into a school and to try it out. So I said, why not? We were just playing with this toolkit. It was mostly developed and researched for older people, but I thought, why not give it a shot and see what happens if we bring it into younger people? So the students went into a high school, and they ran this series of events. And I went in to look at what they were doing, and I thought, this is so interesting, because what they were doing was they were getting the children to screen each other. Now, this was totally innovative. Nobody had done this in the literature. My students had just come up with this idea, and it was a very practical way of doing things. They had got them to do it themselves, because it's much easier than you doing it for. And of course, occupational therapists like getting people to do things for themselves. That's what they do. So I was really intrigued at how well this class was running. And as part of this project, we got some vouchers from an optometrist where people could go for a free optometry visit. And so that was our way of tracking whether, after being screened, whether people actually went off to an optometrist when they needed it. And it was really interesting, because nobody went to the optometrist. And then we reminded them, and one person went to the optometrist. And I thought, this is really interesting. And then I started to look at it a bit more, and I realized that there might be an issue, because I had assumed that everybody gets screened. All the children get screened for vision, because my children were screened. So I thought that that's what happened, but I didn't understand the difference between just vision screening and mandatory vision screening, where it's part of a public health screening program. There's a real difference. So in one, you are followed up, as you know, if you're part of a screening program. In the vision screening that's carried out with children, if the child isn't at school on that day, they're not going to get screened. So this is a bit of a glitch with the system, and it was clearly something that seemed to be a place where children could fall through the cracks. So not only are they not necessarily getting screened, but we found that when they did get screened, they didn't necessarily go to an optometrist. So this was like, I started to get really interested, and that was just for one little student project where the students had essentially set it up. So the following year I went back to the Participatory Science platform. They have been very kind to me. And I said, I've got another project where it's about teaching people about science, and what do you think? And so they said yes, as usual. They've always said yes to me. In fact, they've come to me and asked me if I wanted funding. So we were lucky enough at that point that Sarah Drummond just said, I would like to take a year off my studies, and it was just wonderful, because that meant I could employ her for a year as our research assistant. So we put together this project where we developed a vision screening toolkit. We moved on from the Eyes Right toolkit and we developed one, and we put together a team that included an optometrist, Kalichi, who's here, and teachers and occupational therapists, and who else have I forgotten? Optometrists, yeah, teachers, and product designers. That's what I knew. I'd got more people. And product designers, I never will work without working with designers, again, having done this process, because we very rapidly started in 7 iterations to develop a completely new screening toolkit, going back to the children, asking them their opinions, and then coming back, redesigning, going back to the children. And by the end of a few months, we had a really nice toolkit developed, and we had screened all the children. And Sarah as well very rapidly started to put together a prototype of a module that we could use to teach the children about vision science and vision health, so that the vision screening was done in the context of about 3 hours of teaching. So we could start to increase the level of awareness about vision as we were doing it. So having followed on from that project, in the first year we screened about 220 children and none of them went to an optometrist, that we could see maybe one. We don't know if anybody got glasses. After doing this project with Tahuna, we followed them up a year later, and out of the 21 children that we recommended to go to an optometrist, pretty well all of them went except for a few who could not afford to go and who wouldn't go. But all of the rest of them went, and from that 21 children, 7 of them got glasses, and even more importantly, wear them. Because the other thing we found was that children don't wear their glasses. Lots of things we discovered along the way that I didn't even think was to do with occupational therapy, but of course everything to do with children's occupations is what occupational therapists do. We work with the senses, and we work with teachers to ensure that any health issues can be worked on before the children fall behind and become priority learners. So the teachers and the schools have been really willing to work with us, and we're continuing to do this project, and we hope eventually that we might be able to take it further. We have begun to get the glimmers of the fact that this is way beyond what we can achieve, but what we do know is that if we work with people more effectively, if we put our energy with doctors and pediatricians and with optometrists and ophthalmologists, we may get a national screening program, but our project will be a very good one to raise awareness of what's happening in schools. So every year, as part of the Visual Impairment Charitable Trust Aotearoa, VICTA, our students have worked really hard at building awareness and building that kind of political awareness that is hopefully going to make the difference once the government and the Ministry of Health eventually starts to do more work in this area. In 2016, we took over the Octagon, and we did things like we ran a mobility scooter obstacle course, and this picture here, not very clear, is of a policeman on a mobility scooter with a blind on him doing an obstacle course, and it just demonstrates that disability and is in direct relationship to accessibility. And in 2018, we ran a Safe Site Symposium here, and we started to increasingly improve our interdisciplinary practice. We worked with students from occupational therapy, from business, from IT, from design, from law school up the road, from photography. So we included so many students in that Safe Site Symposium. And we also brought in optometrists and ophthalmologists and occupational therapists into this space, and we brought together different support groups. And in an area which has been noted for its fractionated kind of quality, it's really powerful to create events where we can bring people together. And this year, Lindley and I were sitting during the lockdown, about a few weeks into it, thinking, what do we do to keep our group together? How do we keep people connected? And we came up with the idea of a radio show, Sight Unseen Aotearoa, which has now been running for about 4 months every week. And that's been a great way of increasing and including conversations that aren't just local, but that are national and international. And we have people listening in now from Canada and the UK. And even more importantly, we're finding ways to have conversations with people across this vision world in New Zealand in ways that I think are healing. And in the meantime, we have our students working in the background, creating more podcasts, and communication design students who is redoing the Victor website. So it's always integrating with student learning. No, skipped one. So this is me. There's a golden thread that runs all through of this. It mightn't seem obvious, but for me, there is a thread that comes through this spiral. It's what occupational therapy and teaching means to me, that one's sculpted by the things you do. I've been made by all the projects that I've done. And I hope that the examples I've given you will tell you that it's all about relationships for me. I work in the language of science and I represent some of the most conventional forms of therapy. However, I know that by starting with simple things, that's how you build deeper relationships. So the picture at the top there is of me doing my first research project, looking like a startled, I don't know what, because I was faced with all of these shards of pottery that I was trying to make sense of. And that was my first research job. And then I was lucky enough to be able to get a degree in occupational therapy, which allowed me to travel, and which I fell in love with instantly, and that surprised me. And that has continued to be a passion for me. And over 30 years, it has given me so many ways to grow. And I think one of the best things that I heard today was one of the students who said, I'm going to be a professor in 30 years' time. And if I can do anything, I hope that it is breaking the way for new people to be professors of occupational therapy. And here's a picture of my beautiful young husband many, many years ago. He doesn't recognize himself. So to all my teachers, past and present, I could not have got here without those teachers who've believed in me and believed in, before I believed in myself. First of all, to my father, who thought I could do anything I wanted. My Uncle Billy, who wrote me stories as a missionary from places all over the world. And so I got to imagine places before I ever thought I could go there. And Sister Teresina, who was a little nun, who did inquiry-based learning before anybody ever knew what it was. That was my whole primary school teaching. And to Peter Wilson, who treated me as an academic before I ever believed I could be one. And Anne Bray, who worked actively at opening doors for her students. And Charity, my beloved spiritual master, who taught me to have courage. And those who are still present. There's Lindley. Lindley, who has been my partner in all things Wickedly Vision over the last several years, and we've had such fun, and who can wheel statistics like a song. And Rosemary Colton, who introduced me to the art and the philosophy and the poetry of occupation. And to Maeve, my very best friend from childhood times, who's talked about love for decades with me. And to Claire Amos and Shan Griffiths, my thinking partners who've had language and integrity in their bones. And to Robert, who every single day helps me to be the person that I want to be. And to Finley, Ian and Scott, who make me laugh every single day. And to be brave. And to my mother, who is my best teacher ever for what it means to grow old with grace. And finally, to Grant Gillette, who has shown me what it is to be a professor. Thank you.
Well, you will have noticed how generous Mary is. Sorry about this, but I'm a bit emotionally incontinent since I had my basal ganglia stroke. Before that, Years ago, Peter Wilson was a very lovely friend, and he stimulated my academic interest, just as he stimulated Mary. And he enlisted me to help mark her master's thesis, and then I got the added benefit from marking her PhD as well. I think I learnt more from them than what I ever did in marking them. I'm now a disabled person. Fortunately for me, my stroke has been cognitively sparing. But that's made me realise that many people who came to me and I saw as a clinician, I used to underestimate because they spoke awkwardly or they moved awkwardly. And that disparaging label, retard, was one that you too easily slipped into as a young and aspiring academic, but really it dismisses people. And I think Mary has shown us that everybody has their depths, has their life to contribute in a way that nobody else ever can. And they make that life, with our help, something unique, something which nobody else could ever make, except for them. And to dismiss that in any way is to disparage people and to develop an arrogance about your own abilities, which is so misguided that you really just benefit enormously by laying it aside. And if anything, Mary has shown by her very empathic and thorough study of life through the eyes of those who have thought that it has been destroyed for them, has shown that life isn't destroyed, even if it looks as if it has been, and that you can rebuild. If somebody takes the trouble to find out how you would like to rebuild it. And that is inestimable in its value. So thank you, Mary, for everything you've done for so many people, including myself, as I began to struggle my way back into academia. Mary would come around and talk about my ideas. She knew I was a gas bag and loved to talk about my ideas, and she understood that this was taking me back to something which I thought was my strength, and that by exercising that, I would recover beyond that which I thought was possible. And of course, she has been right, because she has got immense experience with patients from Patians, those who suffer. Thank you again. And I think you will have all seen from her address what a wonderfully empathic and practical understanding of those of us who struggle with disability she has internalized and made herself in the image of. Thank you again.
Oh, Lindley. Thank you.
I don't think flower girls have to speak, but this has been wonderful, Mary, and what an amazing journey you've come on, and we're all looking forward to the next exciting chapters to come, so well done.
We'll have them with you around Linley, that's for sure. There's always the next adventure. So I think at this stage what I do is I invite Ron to bless the food, if that's okay. Oh, you've got your own one there. Okay.
Sure is. Where is it?
Coming.
So I'll bless it through the windows because I've got those sort of skills, the karakia that I can do can go through glass. So no mai ka hui o nei, te ao te waitai te wai Māori, nā rungana tāne nā Māori. E rangi nui e tu atu nei, papa tū nu ki tako hui o nei, whakamaua kia tīna, aumi hui e tai e. So the words that I said about the food were that I acknowledge the food and the places that it comes from. The food that's brought to us from the land and from the sea, from the rivers, from those emerald isles, from that wahi paunui that we love. And the function of food is to bring us together as people. And it's very fitting, those words, homi, hui, tae, ki, we come together, we gather together, we move forward together. It's been the theme of Mary's presentation tonight, the theme of her work over time. So when it gets here, it'll all be good to eat.
Must have finished too soon. Okay.
I wonder if anyone has any questions for Mary while we're just waiting for food to be served.
Or chat.
I can pass the microphone around.
It's wonderful to have the old occupational therapy team here. That back in the 90s we started a curriculum which was really based on this way of thinking about using Hannah Arendt's work and also thinking about food and paper and plays as our way of developing a whole curriculum. So I'm really proud to have Rosemary and Jill here from that time. It's lovely to have you. Nathan.
Kia ora, Mary. Thank you so much for what you've shared with us this afternoon. Very eye-opening stuff. I guess I don't have a question so much as just an observation that I really liked that you included that photo of yourself with all of the shards of pottery. I think there's a real metaphor there to be found in like bringing people together in all our different unique, ways and our own backgrounds and experiences. So yeah, thanks heaps for at least showing us that and kind of helping open our eyes in that regard. Yep.
I was actually, by the way, I didn't say this, I was actually a world expert on west coast of Scotland medieval pottery, which was quite easy because I think there was only 2 people in the whole world interested in it. So, yeah. But it, it was a great start to research.
Kia ora, Mary. Thank you. That was really amazing. And my question just follows on from that. What got you from archaeology to...
Well, what a good question,
therapy?
and I hope I can make that golden thread obvious. Well, in all honesty, it was on the occupational priority list to get into New Zealand, and I was going to get arthritis if I kept going in archaeology. There was no doubt about it. So I did, my parents kept on saying, could I ever stop, just picking up old rubbish and do a proper career? So there was a steady trickle of pressure. It was great fun. It was great fun for my whole 20s. We went from excavation to excavation. We were essentially the eco-warriors of the time. We were rescuing archaeology ahead of all these old buildings and things. And I actually didn't tell you that I actually started there was a number of false starts before I ever got anywhere. And I think that's a really good message for young people these days, because I started off in architecture. And then I read a W.H. Auden poem that said all architects should be carpenters. So I became the first female apprentice carpenter in Ireland. And then I was a rotten carpenter. So I went and I worked in a what you call a windmill energy company doing their drawings for them. And then I got really upset about the fact that there was one site which was called Woodkey that was destroyed, and that's what sent me into archaeology. And I suppose I didn't think I was a people person. In all honesty, I never thought I was a people person. I thought I was a things person. And I think I've kind of kept that kind of energy all the way through. I still think very strongly, I'm both abstract and quite concrete. I do need things, prototypes. Why I probably like working with designers actually, is I need things to think with. I don't know, I was lucky is all I can think. Education was free back then. We just did. We went from one thing to the next, and I happened to absolutely adore occupational therapy the minute I walked through the door. It was a plain good education. It was amazing to be taught by people who really cared. Yeah. Oh yeah, I've got some things here which you might like to explore actually, by the way. Leslie's reminding me. I happen to have the trees that Karley made here, which are very, very beautiful. My one and a little mini one that she's made recently. And I happen to have the film that William Fairbank made, that we made together, and that's actually on YouTube if you want to see it. And I'm still actually writing that one up. If you want to play with some vision simulation gear, we have some vision simulation things here. And here we have our kit, our vision screening kit that we developed, which you might like to explore as well. It's rather beautiful, isn't it, Sarah? Yes. Yeah, yeah. So thank you for that. Any other, sorry?
Is the vision screening kit going to be available for people to purchase throughout New Zealand?
Oh, that would be a good one. And we think that probably the best way, Julie, is to actually put it online. I think that's what the next iteration is going to be, because we realize that this is really expensive to produce, and everybody's going to take the boxes home with them if we do this. So we think we're going to put it online. We may well have to have a chart. There may have to be hard copy, because we do know that both therapists and teachers like something that is hard copy. I've done quite a bit of work with therapists asking them about their preferences for online and hard copy, and you probably know about the state of internet in hospitals and how much improvement needs to be done there before we can completely depend on it. But that's what Machiko and I are working on at the moment, is developing an online school kit so that we could then take it to other schools around the country. And we had a recent article in the Education Gazette, and about 7 schools have asked to take part in the next phase of it. So we've got quite a lot of interest, and we think that it's got a lot of potential. I don't think, as I say, it's the ultimate solution for vision screening. I think our best job is to make people aware. It's not that we're, like I've always been really keen to say, we're not optometrists. We're not trying to do the same job as optometrists. We're trying to get an awareness of what might the issues be, and then think about how applying that to all the different occupations that people do. And as you know, occupational therapists deal with the eye from the front of the eye to the back of the brain. We're thinking about vision as a whole system all the time. And in many ways, it's quite ironic that I've gone for what looks like the simplest thing, which is vision screening, when occupational therapists so often are working with things like vision perception and visual motor and all these really complicated things. But I think a key message for me is to use something really simple to start the conversation. And I think if you start with vision screening, you're more likely to get people talking about vision, and then we can do all the other things that we're quite capable of doing. But we have to make sure we don't forget about the obvious. Yeah, but you're right. Hopefully not for purchase. Hopefully it'll roll out without purchasing, because we know how difficult that is. Thank you. Thank you.